Hey everybody, welcome to the second lecture on the brain. Last time we talked, we had done the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. So today, we are going to do the parietal lobe of the cerebrum. And don't forget that the frontal and the parietal lobe, they are going to be separated by this central sulcus right here. And last time we talked about this precentral gyrus. So today, we're going to talk about this dark blue guy here. This is the postcentral gyrus. And the job of the postcentral gyrus is to act as the primary, so the very important, somatosensory body sensing cortex. Okay? This is where information from sensory neurons in the skin as well as proprioceptors in your muscles and your joints are going to go. So this is going to tell you about touch, body position, and body awareness. Now, this is a contralateral situation, meaning whatever's going on the left side of your body is going to be understood and interpreted and analyzed in the right side of your cerebrum. Now, if you remember, we kind of looked at how the precentral gyrus had a correlation to different body parts. Different regions of that gyrus corresponded to different body parts. It's the same basic idea with the postcentral gyrus, with the primary somatosensory cortex. The different regions of this cortex are going to be correlated with different regions of the body. So we got the genitals, which we did not see in the primary motor cortex. Then we got the toes, the foot, the leg, the hip, the trunk, the neck. Neck's a little smaller too. Shoulder, arm, elbow, forearm, wrist, hand, fingers. Fingers and thumbs, still pretty good proportion, just like it was for the motor one. Because think about the sensitivity of our fingers. Much more sensitive than, say, our hip. And we got the eyeball, the nose, the face, the lips, teeth, gums, and jaw. We didn't really see the lips, teeth, and gums when we were looking at the motor one. Then we had our tongue, our pharynx, and even intra-abdominal. So again, it's this basic idea where parts of this gyrus correspond to parts of the body. Now, this is a sensory homunculus, so it's a person drawn with the proportions based on the primary somatosensory cortex. Now, I asked you to draw me a motor homunculus last time. You do not have to draw this guy, okay? You don't need to draw me a sensory homunculus. All right, this is excellent. Let's keep moving backwards here, because behind the primary somatosensory cortex is the somatosensory association cortex. This is going to be where we kind of figure out maybe what we're feeling or what's touching us, where we interpret that information about touch and body position. So if you had some coins in your pocket, I mean, who has coins in their pocket anymore? But if suppose you did, you could probably reach in and touch them, and you feel Thomas Jefferson's face, and you realize, hey, that's a nickel, without even looking at it. That's your somatosensory association cortex at work. All right. If we go down a little bit to our temporal lobe, and we get onto that top of the temporal lobe right there, we're going to find the primary auditory cortex. This is the major place where sound information enters your brain. So sound waves are going to hit your eardrum, which is going to move your ear bones, which is going to shake nervous structures, which are going to send action potentials to eventually this auditory cortex. This is where you are going to sense your things you're hearing. So on the top of the temporal lobe there, near the lateral sulcus. Now, nearby, a little bit posterior to it, is this area called Wernicke's area, named after that guy right there. I don't remember his first name. Carl, maybe? I don't know. But Wernicke's area is very much connected to that primary auditory cortex, because Wernicke's area is involved in understanding written and spoken language. Remember, we had Broca's area for forming the sounds involved in speech. Now Wernicke's area is understanding that speech, whether it's oral or whether it's written down. Okay. If we were to pull back the lateral sulcus and sneak a peek into that medial temporal lobe, we would see the olfactory cortex. So we know we have smell receptors in our nose. We have olfactory epithelium there. Binding of odorant molecules is going to stimulate those neurons. Signals are going to travel up through that cribriform plate to that olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, and onward to the olfactory cortex. Now, surprisingly, these smell stimuli are very much involved in memories and emotions. Kind of interesting. Okay, might be it for the temporal lobe. Let's see. Yes, it is. We are moving onward to the back of our brain, the occipital lobe. In the very back of the occipital lobe, very posterior part, we're going to find the primary visual cortex. Now, light is going to strike cells in our retina called rods and cones. Signals are going to be sent via our optic nerves to ultimately get back to our primary visual cortex. This is our light sensing cortex. This is the biggest sensory area we have. We think about the senses like hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, etc. Vision gets the most brain area because it is just such an important sense. We rely so much on vision. Now, if we take a look, we can see there's the eyeball with the retina, optic nerve coming back. Remember from lab that at the optic chiasm, some axons switch sides, but some stay on the same side. What this does is it gives us kind of a weird contralateral thing where what I see in my right field of view goes to my left occipital lobe, and what I see in my left field of view goes to my right occipital lobe. Because both eyes get chunks of both halves of your field of view. If I just lost you there, so don't worry about it. I'm not going to test you on that that aspect of the contralaterality here. Do you notice that we do go to the thalamus first, so we can filter any unwanted signals before they get back to our occipital lobe? All right, near, kind of encircling, wrapping around the primary visual cortex is this lighter green area here in this pic called the visual association area. Now, this is more than just a light sensing area. This is where we're going to start getting into knowing what we're seeing, all right? We're looking at something and I'm like, oh, that's a pen. Oh, that's John. Oh, that's this, whatever it might be. So that's starting to happen in our visual association area. All right. Excellent. We got one more lobe to do, guys. One more final lobe. It's the insula. The insula, of course, is tucked away, hidden. You got to pull out that lateral sulcus to see it. It contains the gustatory cortex. Gustatory refers to your sense of taste. So your taste processing and sensation is going to happen in your insula. The insula is also involved in what's called interoception, like your reception of your interior signals. Think about the fullness of your stomach. That's interoception. That's your insula as well. It's involved in other things too. All right, folks, I think we're done with the cerebrum. Well, I spoke too soon. We're done with the cerebral cortex. But if you remember, when we look at a coronal section of that cerebrum, we see the outer cortex, which which is the gray matter. And that's what we've been talking about recently, like gustatory cortex, primary auditory cortex, right? It was all outer layer. Then deep to it, we've got white matter, but then there are these islands of gray matter that are even farther, even deeper. And some of these guys are referred to as the basal nuclei. Basal because they're deeper, nuclei because they're gray matter, they're clusters of somata. And there's a couple, like there's the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus that we can see here. Okay? They're very much involved in movement control, like in making movement smooth, for example. Like if moving without jerking, like without shaking. So deciding how to start and stop smoothly. Basal nuclei are also involved in learned behaviors. Remember we talked about that in the premotor cortex as well. Now, there's also this little almond-shaped guy down here called the amygdala, or amygdaloid body. Very much involved in your emotional state, in your mood as well. Okay. Excellent. Let's keep going. So we're done the gray matter in the cerebrum. Let's do some white matter stuff. Now, there are three basic types of white matter fibers. We use the word fibers because the white matter is made up of axons. Axons are long and skinny, so they're often called fibers. And what kind of axons? Myelinated axons. Now, one of the basic types are these guys outlined in green right here. These are called commissural fibers. We met the corpus callosum in lab. The corpus callosum is an example of a group of commissural fibers. Commissural fibers are going to connect the right cerebral hemisphere to the left, and vice versa. Now, they're not the only ones. We also have these guys depicted in pinkish here. The pinkish ones are association fibers. Association fibers connect different areas of the same cortex together. So, connecting your auditory cortices with your visual ones. And then there's one more, the ones that are displayed here in, purple? Yeah, in purple. Those are known as projection fibers. Projection fibers are going to go from the cerebrum to other lower structures, like to the thalamus in this case, or down to the brainstem and to the cord. So those are our three basic types of fibers: commissural, association, and projection. All right. Okay. If I look at this right here, what kind of fibers do you see right here? What kind of fibers are these right here? Those are commissural. What about these guys going right here? Those are projection. We could also imagine that we can see some association ones here as well. It'll kind of a little bit harder to visualize. All right. Here we see the two cerebral hemispheres kind of pulled apart at the longitudinal fissure to show you all the fibers in the white matter of the corpus callosum, which you remember was our example of commissural fibers. All right. So now, guys, we are done with the cerebrum. Yay! So all we got to do is the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The diencephalon is kind of in the central core of the brain there. It's hidden away. The cerebrum kind of mushrooms around it during development. And there are three structures that we're going to look at in the diencephalon. Notice how they all have thalamus in their name. Thalamus is the thalamus, and there's the hypothalamus and the epithalamus. So we're going to look at all three of these guys. Now, if we do a sagittal section, we can see the big egg-shaped thalamus right there. It's the biggest part of the diencephalon. Kind of anterior, inferior to it is the hypothalamus. And kind of to the posterior, a little bit down, is the epithalamus as well. So we can see all three of those right there. Let's start with the thalamus. The thalamus is that big egg right there. It's actually like two eggs side by side. And we're looking at a slice between them here. We do see the interthalamic adhesion that connects the two sides. It is primarily a sensory relay station. So almost all your senses except for smelling go to your thalamus before they go to other brain centers. And this lets the thalamus like figure out what's going on and makes a decision as to what's important and what needs to make it all the way to your cortex. So you don't need to know that your shorts are pressing on your skin right now. You don't need to know that. So your thalamus filters that out. You don't want to be bombarded by sensory stimuli. Now, the thalamus is not just a sensory signal. It does have motor and cognitive functions as well. All right. If we look at this picture here, it just kind of nicely depicts somatic senses, touch and body position to the thalamus. Balance to the thalamus. Sound to the thalamus. Vision to the thalamus. Taste to the thalamus. Then from the thalamus, we go to the different areas that we need to go to. But smells, I don't like how they have it like coming through your cheek here. It should have come up like that. But smells are going to go basically straight to the olfactory cortex. No stopping at the thalamus for smells. And this relates to just how important smells are in the animal kingdom. Not so important for us anymore, but hey, that's what we got. All right, let's talk about that hypothalamus now. The hypothalamus, if we backtrack for a second, we see it underneath, kind of in front of the thalamus, near that optic chiasm, near that infundibulum, near that mammillary body right there. There's the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus has a whole bunch of different nuclei in it that are involved in a lot of things. They're involved in controlling a lot of hormones in your body. The hypothalamus is involved in controlling your autonomic nervous system. Remember, fight or flight, rest and digest. We'll actually do a whole section on that later. And the hypothalamus is also involved in a lot of homeostatic stuff, including, and we see a bunch of stuffs here, bunch of stuffs. I just said stuffs. Is stuffs even a word? I don't think so. Maybe a verb, right? Stuffs. He stuffs the turkey. Anyway, we got to get back on track. Homeostatic stuff, blood pressure, water balance, body temperature, satiety, feeding, all very important stuff. There's other things as well. Other things like your biological clock is in your hypothalamus, which is kind of neat. Sometimes I wish we had more time to go into all this stuff. Do you ever feel like we're not doing enough stuff in this class? Do you ever feel underwhelmed? If you do, shoot me an email and say, hey, I'm so underwhelmed by all this. And I'll do my best to fix that. All right. Let's talk pituitary gland too, since we're right next to it. When we're in the hypothalamus has the connection, called the infundibulum, down to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland actually has two different parts. There is a front anterior pituitary, and there is a back, a posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is going to make and release several hormones. And we'll mention a couple here. Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, and growth hormone. We met growth hormone when we were talking about bones and epiphyseal plates. Now, we'll talk about the other ones in a moment. Until we get there, the posterior half of the pituitary gland is going to store, but not make, two hormones, one called antidiuretic hormone and one called oxytocin. We made oxytocin like in the very first lecture topic where we talked about childbirth and positive feedback. Now, these guys, these two hormones, are actually made up in the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is then going to send them down to the pituitary, who hangs on to them and releases them when necessary. All right. I know what you're wondering. You're thinking, can we look at some microscopic pictures of the pituitary gland? And the answer is not yet. But when you get to AMP2, you'll do that in AMP2 lab. So yay, got that to look forward to. All right, this is an ovary. This is an ovary right here. The ovary has developing egg cells. Developing egg cells are found in these structures called follicles. Follicles grow and mature. During every menstrual cycle, a single follicle ruptures and an egg cell is released. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the follicles to grow. And follicle stimulating hormone is released by the anterior pituitary gland. Now, I know what you're thinking here. You're like, well, what about guys? What about dudes? And in guys, follicle stimulating hormone is going to play a role in spermatogenesis, in making sperm cells. So even though it's named after its role in the female, it has testicular functions too. All right. Notice in this picture, by the way, that this is a rupturing follicle right here. So this happens at ovulation. So day 14 of the menstrual cycle, day 1 being the first day of bleeding. Day 14 is ovulation day, and the egg cell is released. Once the egg cell is released, the remaining follicle bits are transformed into this structure called the corpus luteum. We just mentioned a hormone called luteinizing hormone a moment ago. The pituitary gland makes a hormone called luteinizing hormone, which is going to convert the leftover follicle into the structure called the corpus luteum. Now, the way the ovary works, every time the ovary ovulates, releases an egg cell, the ovary thinks, we're gonna get pregnant this time. And so it makes this corpus luteum, thanks to luteinizing hormone, and the corpus luteum makes progesterone, which prepares the body for pregnancy. Whether or not it actually happens, every cycle the body prepares for it. Anyhow, more on this in AMP2. Right now, we just got to know the anterior pituitary makes follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They have effects on the ovary, follicle growth, ovulation, the production of this thing called the corpus luteum. Now, luteinizing hormone is involved in testosterone production in guys. So, playing a role over there too. All right, enough of that. Prolactin, another hormone from the anterior pituitary, is very much involved in milk production, while oxytocin, that was a posterior pituitary hormone, is very much involved in the smooth muscle contraction that moves the milk and ejects the milk, allowing the baby to feed. Guys have both these hormones as well. Oxytocin is very much involved in bonding. So like, dad holds his newborn baby for the first time, falls in love with it immediately. That's oxytocin playing a role there. Okay. We also had this other hormone called ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, from the posterior pituitary. It is going to raise your blood volume and blood pressure. It makes you pee less and it squeezes your blood vessels. Antidiuretic against peeing. And if you pee less, your blood volume is going to stay up. More volume of blood, more pressure due to that blood. Okay, wonderful. Done with the hypothalamus, done with the pituitary gland, for the time being at least. The epithalamus, and the only part of it we really want to worry about is this part back here, the pineal gland, which we met in lab. The pineal gland is going to secrete melatonin. Melatonin is responsible for your sleep-wake cycle. This is why it's important not to have like all those bright lights on, or to be looking at your phone right before you go to bed, because those bright lights, maybe you don't want to sleep with the light on, you don't want to sleep with the TV on, you don't want to look at your phone before you go to bed. even though I do that all the time. I know better, but I still do it. Because that messes with your melatonin production. With less melatonin, harder to fall asleep and harder to get good sleep. Okay, some animals actually have a clear patch where light can go and directly hit their pineal gland. This is especially true in lizards. This is some sort of lizard, I forget what kind. And snakes and things where the seasons and the amount of light they're getting drastically affects their behavior and their reproduction. Okay, I think we're done with the diencephalon. Yes! Can you sense my excitement here? We're moving on to the brainstem. And we saw in lab, there are 3 parts to the brainstem. There is the midbrain. There is the pons. And there is the medulla oblongata. So 3 parts to that midbrain. 3 parts to that brainstem. And we'll start with the midbrain. Sitting right there. That's not a very anatomical description. Sitting inferior to the diencephalon and superior to the pons. It is the superior-most part of the brainstem. It's the superior-most part of the brainstem. Now, a bunch of different things we got to notice here. We do have the cerebral aqueduct, which runs right here, connecting that 3rd ventricle to that 4th ventricle down here. Now, sorry, I lost my train of thought. All right, so we got CSF flowing down through that cerebral aqueduct, kind of on the front and side of the midbrain or the cerebral peduncles, which are going to basically carry those pyramidal axons down into the brainstem and also out into the cerebellum. Now, posterior to the cerebral aqueduct, we got the tectum right there. And the tectum has 4 bulges. We see 2 of them here. And those 4 bulges are collectively called the corpora quadrigemina, the 4 twin bodies. Let's take a look here. There we go. If we take a look here, we can see the peduncle on the side with those pyramidal axons. We can see the 4 twin bodies of the corpora quadrigemina right here. And by the way, look at the 2 egg halves of the thalamus and the pineal gland sneaking out the back right there. Now, the corpora quadrigemina is made up of 2 superior colliculi and 2 inferior colliculi. Let's talk about what those do. The superior colliculi are very much involved in visual reflexes, like fixing your eyes on a ball while your body runs underneath to catch it. Or if like you're watching somebody running and your eyes move to follow that person. So holding that gaze on somebody or something. Now, the inferior colliculi, there we go. Inferior colliculi, by the way, a colliculus is a little hill. It's like a little bump. The inferior colliculi are involved in auditory reflexes, auditory integration, like the startle reflex, where you hear a sound and you turn your head towards it. We see those beautiful little things right there. Very, very nicely. All right. The pons. Moving our way down to the pons. Look at the bulginess of the pons. It's pretty big. Bigger than the other 2 parts of the brainstem. It's inferior to the midbrain, superior to the medulla. Its name literally means bridge. And it's going to have a lot of white matter tracts connecting higher and lower structures. Diencephalon, cerebellum, spinal cord, cerebrum. Lots of stuff passing through that pons. There are nuclei of gray matter in the pons. There are nuclei involved in sneezing, involved in respiration, involved in peeing. I didn't want to show a picture of a person peeing, so I showed someone who had to pee. Anyhow, that's neither here nor there. Let's keep going. Done with the pons. That was fast. The medulla oblongata is below the pons. So it's inferior to the pons, superior to the rest of the cord, more or less ends just at the foramen magnum. It has the axons from the primary motor cortex. Remember those pyramidal neurons sent their axons down? And they're called the pyramids in the medulla. And they actually cross. Remember we saw that? We talked about that a while ago. And the crossing of the pyramidal axons is called the decussation of the pyramids. And it is what results in contralateral control. Now, there are nuclei too. There's gray matter too in your medulla. And the gray matter is very much involved in control of things like heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate, vomiting, burping, all sorts of stuff. All right, quickly we rock through the medulla. Although we can see the pyramids nicely in this picture. Look at those pyramids right there. And we can see the little cross-hatching here. That's where the decussation is happening. Okay. On that note, we are done with the brainstem. Cerebellum time. Cerebellum inferior to the occipital lobe, posterior to the brainstem. Very much involved in coordinating complex movements, as well as in paying attention, and even in language. If you were a young pitching phenom for the New York Mets, you would need to have a very well-functioning cerebellum. We can see the two hemispheres of the cerebellum up here, as well as the vermis in between. We met that vermis in lab. There it is right there as well. Now, we can see little homunculi, little representations on this cerebellum, 3 of them in fact, that correspond to different areas of your body. Look at the size of the hands and the feet and the eyes. And that makes sense when we're thinking about coordination. All right. That was so fast. We went through the cerebellum so darn quickly. All right. Let's talk about the reticular formation. The reticular formation is a whole bunch of different structures. It is a whole bunch of different structures. It is going to be in your brainstem primarily. You can see here a whole bunch of brainstem function of structures. And it has both motor and sensory parts. The motor parts are very much involved in like maintaining muscle tone. I mean, if you're just, thinking about, you're sitting here listening to this video, you've got a lot of muscles involved in maintaining that posture and keeping tone. It also has a sensory part called the reticular activating system. This is very much involved in like mental alertness, in taking stimuli, whether that's touch, whether that's hearing, whether that's vision, and using that to kind of like make us aware, like to alert us. If you think about like a mom at a playground and it's noisy and she's ignoring all sorts of sounds, but all of a sudden she hears that cry of her kid and boom, she looks up and she knows she picked that one sound out. That's the reticular activating system. It is what gets you up in the morning. It wakes you up. Sometimes my reticular activating system doesn't work well enough in the morning. All right, little quick part there. And now we are on to the limbic system. The limbic system. The limbic system has a bunch of structures. A lot of them are involved in emotion and memory, including the hypothalamus, the amygdala, which we met earlier, which is involved in emotion and memory, the mammillary body, which is involved in smells and memory, especially like stitching memories together into a story. The hippocampus, which is very much involved in spatial memory. If you were to, become a cab driver in London and basically have to memorize the entire map, your hippocampus would be very much involved in that. You got your cingulate gyrus, which is a gyrus that we didn't mention it earlier, but it's important in this limbic system too, as well as the fornix, which we learned about as that tract of white matter that is linking the diencephalon to the cerebrum. All right, particularly the hippocampus. So with that, we got only 2 more things to talk about, and then we're done this lecture. Last things to talk about are the pathways into and out of the brain. If we look at our spinal cord, like we're doing here, we see tracts. We see groups of axons going to and from the brain. Ascending tracts are in blue here. They are going to be sensory. Descending tracts are in red. They are going to be motor. We are not going to learn all these names, but we do have to know a couple of things. The sensory pathways, the ones that were in blue, which tend to be towards the back and the sides, are going to run from receptors to the brain. They can be somatosensory, like from the body, so think skin, proprioceptors in your joints to the brain, or viscerosensory, like going from your internal organs, your stomach, your lungs, your heart to your brain. Generally, it's a 2 to 3 neuron path, paired because, we got lefts and rights, and there is a decussation, there is a crossing over, so that there is contralateral sensation. Now, if we compare this, if we look at this, there we go. If we look at a picture, we see a somatosensory pathway here. We got some mechanoreceptors for touch in your skin, proprioceptors in your muscles for body awareness, going back into the back of the spinal cord, up the spinal cord to the medulla, switching sides to the thalamus for filtering, and then onward to the primary somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. And that was a 3 neuron pathway. All right. Cool. If we look at the motor pathway, it's generally 2 neurons going from the brain to the effector, for example, to the skeletal muscle. It is, of course, paired because, again, we got lefts and rights. And there is decussation, there is a switching of sides, which gives us contralateral control. We saw this picture earlier. It's a beautiful illustration. We're starting in the Postcentral Gyrus, that primary motor cortex, going down to the brainstem, switching sides at the decussation point in the medulla, running down. Our first neuron then ends in the ventral part of the gray matter of the spinal cord, and our motor neuron zooms out to skeletal muscles. So, guys, we are done this brain lecture. The second one, we did 2 brain lectures, which is amazing. Next time we'll meet, we'll do the spinal cord and spinal nerves. Then we'll do cranial nerves after that. Then we'll have a test. Then we'll do the autonomic nervous system. Then we'll do muscles. Then we'll have a test. And then it'll be onward to bigger and better and brighter things for you. And then me, I get to do this all over again. Anyway, I'll see you next time, guys. Take care now. Bye-bye.